Good morning, everyone. I think we should get going. It's 4 minutes past 10. And so let's get going. Welcome to today's seminar, the fifth in the series of the series of seminars that Defend Our Democracy has been hosting over the past, I'd say, 2 months or so. We started late in 2023, and we've been going on since then, almost every second week. The seminars, as you well know, are led by John Mattison, the person who's going to lead our seminar. And today we're doing something slightly different. We're going to have an interlocutor, Professor Garth Lapierre, who is going to join us and make a couple of remarks towards the end after John leads the seminar. I will play less of an interlocutory facilitator role today and play a little more of a chairperson, though I will pose a few questions and, where necessary, discipline our two speakers, because both of you, as you well know, require a little bit of discipline. It's a bit intimidating for me, given that I was junior to both of you, but nevertheless, I have the power and authority today. Welcome, everyone. The theme for today, we're looking at foreign policy, we're looking at South Africa's posture internationally, but with a specific reference towards trade, economy, and development. So we're not looking just at South Africa's foreign policy. I mean, that alone could take not an hour and a half, but probably a year and a half. But regardless, we're going to try and be as succinct as possible. We got till 11:30. As you our interventions are that keep your video off as far as possible. When you speak, you'll be allowed to keep your video on. Most of you will be muted, and you'll be muted for one reason and one reason only, and that is not to dissuade participation. That's just to keep order and minimize basically background noise. Feel free to make comments and interventions in the chat. That will be very welcome. And all the speakers and Defend Our Democracy encourage that. There's also a poll which is being conducted by Polis. You will see that poll question up in the chat, which I will repeat from time to time. And it will relate, obviously, to the theme of our discussion. So again, thanks, Defend Our Democracy, for hosting this. Thanks, John, for leading these discussions in the seminar series. And thanks, Garth, for joining us today. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Just by way of introduction, you've been attending this for quite some time. You all know John Mattison very well, but just by way of short introduction, John has been a veteran journalist. He's been a contributor to our public debate and intellectual life for quite some time. He's worked overseas in Iraq, in Afghanistan, for the UN. Of course, one of the most important things is that he helped President Mandela prepare himself for dealing with the media and the public when he came out of prison. Other than working for the UN in Afghanistan and elsewhere, he also spent some time at the University of Chicago studying development and looking at developmental states globally. And so a lot of what we've done in the series has been to focus on that. And then what we're going to do today, as I said, slightly differently, other than John leading the discussion, we will have Professor Lapierre, who himself an eminent scholar, former director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, expert in trade and international trade and economy, studied in the US at no less than Yale and Princeton, and so on, who is going to be a respondent of sorts that will hopefully leave us some time for discussion. But before we do that, John, you want to go ahead and lead the discussion? You want to take us into today's discussion? So we know the theme: foreign policy, South Africa's posture internationally with regard to trade, economy, and development. John, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Abraham. Good morning, Garth, and good morning, everyone. Because the world's going through so many changes, I want to start by locating South Africa in the wider world, and perhaps add some tools to evaluate the foreign economic policies governments are pursuing, because what's good and bad about free trade is not always obvious or inevitable. Of course, there are hot wars in Sudan, the Middle East, and Ukraine at the moment, continuing conflicts in DRC and Nigeria. Climate change requires new responses. So the global order is being rearranged, but how it's being rearranged is not so clear. South Africa, remember, was born as the Cold War ended. So throughout the 90s and into the early noughties, we lived in a unipolar world. The US was the sole superpower, and of course, it misused its powers, most obviously in the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where I was with you, and in Libya. My professors at the University of Chicago would have said this is inevitable. A sole superpower will always abuse their powers. Will always overreach. As a result of these wars, the whole Middle East was thrown into turmoil. Economically, this same period of South African democracy was an era of free trade and globalization, led by the US, and the role of the state was out of fashion. South Africa participated in those trends. We joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We got rid of tariffs, protections, and we reduced the state. Is that okay?
Hi.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
We have a new member. I thought we went too far in removing trade protections from industries and letting our conglomerates leave the country so freely. I think we're now paying the price for some decisions that didn't serve South Africa's interests, although some did. It's become more common for progressive economists like Danny Roderick to say this: we must be honest about trade's consequences, not just the economic opportunities they create for our businesses and consumers, but the stresses they create for our social compacts. Someone else, Richard Haas, said, globalization has borne the brunt of the blame for the decline of national industries, for destroying decent jobs, and of a growing recourse towards economic nationalism and trade protectionism. I thought those were useful quotes to bear in mind as we think about Africa's restructuring of its role and South Africa's restructuring of its role in global trade. That global pendulum is now swinging back. We're now in an era of deglobalization. Many countries are again looking inward. Foreign investment is being withdrawn from China. At the same time that China is being hit by a property bubble, changes in their economic policies, unsafe shipping routes in the Gulf, and a population time bomb. China now has 2 million less people in China every year. And those that are still alive are becoming less productive because they're getting older. This has consequences. So the US is leading deglobalization. President Biden has greatly increased the economic role of the state in the targeted way I've been advocating for South Africa. For those of you who weren't on the earlier webinar, particularly webinar 3, which is now available on Facebook, spells out exactly how I believe we can turn South Africa around and produce rapid job-creating growth if we're willing to commit to the political will. The main missing ingredient is political will and leadership, rather than money or anything else. So the result of Biden's policies have been that the US grew faster last year than China and widened the gap in size between the US and China to $27 trillion to China's 18. This is the main reason Joe Biden may still beat Donald Trump in the US elections in November this year. Can we put up the first chart, please? The chart going up shows the top 10 countries by size in the world. So you've got US at 27, China 17, this is $1 trillion, Germany, then Japan, India, UK, France, Italy, Brazil. This is not going to stay the same. It's going to change. You notice, by the way, Russia isn't on. Canada is the last one too. What we can expect, obviously lots of things can change. It depends on changing governments and policies. But the likelihood is that India will overtake Germany and Japan in the near future to become the third biggest economy in the world. The main driver, one of the main drivers of these changes, especially the shrinkage of European and Japanese and Chinese economies, is the aging and shrinking of populations in those countries. Oh, Japan, Russia as well. China has that problem. Germany has that problem. It's doing harm to its economy as well as other issues, of course. India does not have that problem. It's already overtaken China by population, and what happened in Japan 30 years ago. Japan's population also started to age and shrink and affect the productivity of the economy. Is now happening in China, Germany, most of Europe, and Russia. So Africa's young population is a great asset, obviously, provided it's used correctly. Many African countries are using it well. And in many ways, this is the African century. Many of the top growth countries in the world are now. So what does this all mean for BRICS? Obviously, South Africa's membership in BRICS is a great asset. It gives us a seat at the table with some of the biggest economies in the world. That's extremely valuable. We must protect it. It will act as a counterweight to the US and the US dollar. It's a voice of the global south, and we are an early member. China and India are great developmental partners for South Africa. The fact that we have such access to them through BRICS and bilateral relationships is really valuable, and we should put every effort into getting the most benefit from them. They're both good developmental partners, and I think both would be willing to do a lot more than we've really asked of them up to now. But the role of BRICS as BRICS is not yet clear. Its biggest members are not of one mind. India's Prime Minister Modi, for example, is building military ties with the United States, Japan, and Australia, while he's also in BRICS. And he has serious disagreements with China, which should not be stated, where a military skirmish 4 years ago that left 20 Indian soldiers dead is still casts a cloud over their relationship. Then there are the new BRICS members. I'll only mention the two regional powers, rival regional powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran. How much will their interests converge and how much will they clash? It's too soon to tell. But clearly for South Africa, the chance to increase trade with BRICS countries must be exploited to the greatest possible degree. But it's also true that currently our exports in value-added goods like motor vehicles and wine are highest to Europe and the US, while our export to the BRICS countries is mostly in raw materials like mining that are not products that are not beneficiated. In this environment, South Africa's foreign policy needs to resemble multi-dimensional chess, not checkers. This is the path that India has chosen, and it's worth studying it, although I'm not going to say more about that now. Deglobalization means countries are moving from offshore manufacturing to what they now call friendshoring and even onshoring. They're moving factories home from China. South Africa needs to do the equivalent, because remember, we have been deindustrializing for 4 decades. This must be reversed. We must reindustrialize. It's absolutely at one with the ideas of the series to focus on sectors where we can produce massive job creation quickly. We need to increase manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. They're key to South Africa's turnaround. Because although joining the WTO and a drop in protection in industries had some positive effects for South Africa, it also had negative ones. As I'm sure you all know, industries like textiles and clothing were devastated. Tens of thousands of people lost jobs. Traditional areas of those industries have been left devastated. Secondly, South Africa's biggest conglomerates left the country. those companies that are still on the JSE have invested heavily abroad. More than half of JSE companies' investments are outside of South Africa. This is a massive rise. You may know that Naspers, the JSE's biggest company, which now split into Naspers and Prosus, is almost entirely a Chinese company in terms of value. Its leading figure, Koos Bekker, has been an important figure in Beijing for 20 years, longer than most of our government members. Naspers, for example, owns newspapers in China that strictly adhere to the strict Chinese Communist Party censorship. I hope this alerts us to resist the temptation to be simplistic in our analysis and policy prescriptions. It's a multi-dimensional chess, not checkers. Of course, not all free trade is bad. Not all moves to reduce state involvement are bad. They need a great deal of nuance and of specificity. We need to ask why we do each of these. As you know, my prescription for South Africa is to prioritize sectors. This is exactly the formula successful Asian and African countries have applied, and now with great success by Joe Biden. The second lesson I draw is that in investment and trade, countries on our own continent are extremely important. Once I stated it should be obvious. If we export to Zimbabwe, transport is cheaper, therefore we're more competitive. Zimbabwe is easier to visit and monitor and supervise. We know our neighbors and their market conditions. We can build relationships that help each other in increasingly complex ways. We can combine tourism benefits. So it's in our interest to support all the countries, especially of the region, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, all the way to Angola, Zambia, and Tanzania, and beyond. If we had not had state capture and were still a thriving infrastructure and institutions, we should be ready to provide institutional support throughout the region, logistics, elections, etc. Unfortunately, we have to face the fact that our economic record of the last 15 years has been poor by comparison with African and Southern African states. As things stand, this is the IMF's prediction for growth in Africa this year. Could you put up the second slide? As you'll see from this, there are a number of countries doing extremely well. Getting over 5%, over 4.5% for an economy is really good. Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda. And at the bottom of this list is South Africa. I think we've done the IMF. This is IMF figures. I think the IMF has downgraded us slightly from 1.8. The point isn't changed. So the formula I prioritized was the information economy, mining, and green economy, and agriculture, particularly supported black smallholder farmers. Each of these could create hundreds of thousands of jobs and reduce inequality. As important, it brings sustainable change, and this is going to be needed to enhance tax revenue to enable us to keep our social grants and other benefits and to increase them, because without it, they will come under increasing pressure. So what does this mean for our foreign policy? We need to constantly test our policy both against our interests and our values. I just want to show you this third chart, which shows the impact that population is having, the impact that population shrinkage, a working age population, is having on economies. I couldn't find one for all the countries, but if you just look at America and Europe, it may surprise you to see that America's growth rate in population is much higher than Europe's, and Europe's is very more or less flat, and America's growth is far greater than Europe, and that gap is getting wider. Ironically, of course, the fact that one of the reasons America is better off is because it has immigration. Despite all the bleating of Trump and the right wing, immigration is a key benefit to a thriving economy, to bring in younger workers and workers willing to do the jobs that the locals are less and less keen to do. Since this is a week when everybody is still talking about South Africa's ICJ case against Israel, I want to just say a word about it, although we'll probably say a bit more about it next time when we talk about the non-trade foreign policy issues. Of course, bringing this case to the ICJ aligns strongly with South Africa's values. It has particular importance because of the liberation movement's historic solidarity with Palestinians. It's also ignited support and enthusiasm for many developing nations. You might fit that into what is sometimes called soft power. By demonstrating leadership in that way, South Africa's diplomacy gains cachet in many places. It's also a significant challenge to the Western argument that it represents the rules-based order and exposes the double standard in supporting the rules-based order, because the judgments of international courts against Putin and others and the allegations of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty when they provide data on Ukraine, for example, are accepted but challenged when they confront Israel. Now, but back to our interests. We're a regional power, but we don't want to be a bully. I think that should not prohibit us from providing constructive support. We don't want to be a bully, but we should be doing much more in the region. And of course, if we repair our infrastructure and our institutions, we should really look to a much more robust foreign policy in the region. And of course, it's directly linked to our interest because it helps to reverse our poor job creation record. And of course, also, xenophobia has been rising in South Africa, and the more we fail to, our neighbors fail, the more immigration we'll face, and of course that will raise xenophobic interests, as you've already seen develop in South Africa. So it's key to South Africa's stability and success that our neighbors succeed too. So I now want to push. So before I get on to trade specifically, I just want to say, obviously, we've been right to push for a reordering of influence in the multilateral bodies, the United Nations, the IMF, etc., and through BRICS, and to strengthen SADC and the AU, and to encourage alternatives to the dollar. Those are all in our interests for multiple reasons of both values and interests. But the point I want to make is that these multilateral rules are not game changers to our domestic economy. I think politicians sometimes imply that free trade with Africa or a single currency with BRICS or with the AU are a magic formula for development, and I don't think they are. And there's a risk that this rhetoric will lead us to a false sense of security, that we don't have to do the things that are absolutely essential if we want to get out of the economic ditch we put ourselves in. So this is particularly why I'm keen to have Professor Lapierre here, because I want to understand how the problems of weaker African countries that could be hurt by a single currency and a free trade agreement will be mitigated, because they are not small problems in my view. So what should we make of the current debates about currency issue? The US dollar has disproportionate power in the world, and its influence will diminish as global South countries trade in their own currencies between them. But my concerns were heightened by the experience of the European Union using the euro. If you remember when the euro was in crisis a decade or two ago, countries with weak economies found being tied to the euro a millstone. Remember the crisis for Greece. My friends in Italy were also very unhappy about the effects of the euro on their standard of living. At that time, it seemed that the UK had dodged a bullet by refusing to join the euro and sticking with the pound, which kept sovereignty of monetary policy with the UK, whereas the rest of Europe had surrendered sovereignty. And if you In certain circumstances, that's a good thing, but you've got to have a very clear understanding of why. Of course, the UK then went and did Brexit. They departed from the trade pact, so they were out of the currency, but then they got out of the trade pact. And of course, the Brexit, I believe, I don't think too many people deny it's been a disaster for the UK. It seemed to me the UK had the right mix, and then Boris Johnson came along and they messed it up. So we have a currency experiment closer to home in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is using the US dollar as its prime currency. To my mind, this has taken away Zimbabwe's monetary sovereignty. They have no control of interests and interest rates. And they're tied to the strongest economy in the world. It brings all sorts of distortions. I checked this morning that the Harare property market commonly sells houses in the 300 to 400,000 US dollar range. The black market rate, exchange rate today is about 15,000 Zim dollars to $1 US. In fact, in some respects, the economy is improving under President Mnangagwa. But the fact is, many people go hungry for lack of dollars. This is a material concern to South Africa, both as a good neighbor and for the well-being of our citizens. That Zimbabwe's inflation is at 176%, higher than Ukraine and Sudan were during war. I would say our bilateral diplomacy should be active. We should encourage them to convert to the rand at least. That may not be first prize, but at least then they'd be tied to a neighboring African currency with an economy with more similarities there of their own, to their own. But it may be better for them to restart their own currency as long as it's on a sounder footing than it was in the past. Now to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, where I'm also looking forward to listening to Professor Lepierre, because I'm concerned with the problems that seem not to get enough attention. The free trade agreements are generally based on the assumption that free trade is good. But as I quoted you from several economists this morning, the answer to that is at least complicated. There is a reason why, if you remember when free trade was at its height 10, 20 years ago, free trade agreements were considered to be neoliberalism at its worst, and they were criticized by respected economists like Roddick, because trade agreements don't benefit all countries equally. Smaller, weaker countries can suffer particularly. If you're a early development country in the world that I can think of, including, you might be interested to know, the United States, the UK, let alone the Asian tigers, Japan, China, or African growth countries like Ethiopia. None of them have depended on free trade. They've done the opposite. In the early stages of building an economy, they've been economic nationalists who have protected their own industries while they grew more powerful. It's a mature economies, including countries that have been against free trade in the beginning, that want free trade because they're the best equipped to benefit from it. This means that my suspicion is that the free trade agreement will most help some of the bigger countries like South Africa. And so I look forward to hearing from Garth, who knows a lot more about our trade policies than I do. I was saying that building a regional bloc could be an incredible powerhouse. The potential for Angola, for Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Namibia, let alone DRC, is enormous. And I would be giving a lot of attention to those, because that's where we can get the biggest bang for the buck. And I think there were ways to support these countries without being the American-style bully, but that supporting them with the kind of resources that South Africa has and could deploy. Just to tell you how the US have reversed its policy specifically in just one paragraph. Biden it hasn't been much remarked on, but at least here that I can see. But Biden applied government industrial policy, exactly things that the IMF and so on has been against in the past, to the United States in three main areas, and the results have been fantastic. Two were intended to compete better with China. The Inflation Reduction Act, which really was a way of spurring green electricity within the United States through a combination of tax incentives and subsidies. And then the CHIPS Act, which was strategically targeted at manufacturing semiconductors, which, along with other executive decisions, have put America back in competition with China and other countries on a whole lot of key IT products. The third thing he did was he began a massive infrastructure program, which of course I would also strongly recommend for South Africa. So finally, you'll note that I think we focused on multilateral. I think we focused on our multilateral relationships at the expense of bilateral ones. I want to raise one underperforming component, underreported component of our foreign relations, and that's the ANC and the SACP's strong party-to-party ties. Thousands of South African members of these parties have traveled to China for training. Now, from talking to people who've done these courses, they mostly were taught about the Chinese political system. I would like to see a very significant shift. You may not think this is directly a foreign policy issue, but in fact, I think it is. I would like to see South Africans, whether it's in political parties or in the national government or in business, focus on asking China for help with South Africa's economic development. They're very good at it. They have many lessons to teach us. I would suggest we ask the authors of their latest development plan, Made in China 2025, to help South Africa to upgrade our thinking. It's been far more successful and far more implemented than our NDP has. The interesting thing to me is I believe that China would be amenable, but we need to ask them. This is where we need help. I believe China and India have some of the best teachers. They're friends. Let's use them to fill the gaps we have. We have plenty of things to offer them in return. So, Ebrahim, I'm going to stop there, and I would love to hear Garth.
Thanks, John. Before we get to Garth, I just want to ask you for a moment just to think about something that you might want to respond to, and that is, you spoke about not just regional cooperation and so on for increased trade, which, as many commenters are saying, are dependent on the density and efficiency and effectiveness of the infrastructure, but also competing interests between different countries. I mean, for example, South Africa has a fairly strong labor regulatory regime. Many others don't. What happens to workers which go there? Same thing with regard to the alignment of banking rules and infrastructure and so on, right? So that's the one thing. The second, which struck me, is you emphasized the advantages of BRICS, and I think you kind of made a throwaway comment about coordination and cooperation between those two countries. But just take the very example you noted about South Africa's ICJ case. One of the BRICS members is terribly close to Israel, for example, India. Now, I mean, how does that start to play out in terms of its cooperation for trade and other areas of cooperation? That's just for you and Garth to think about. Garth, I think it's time for you. I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to come on some of these issues, Garth. So I see you're unmuted. If you want to switch on your camera for a moment, and then you can switch back off again just for stability. But over to you. I know there's a couple people in the chat who are going to have something to say. We will give you an opportunity, but everyone can see it in the chat. Just remember the question of the polis that DOD would like you to participate on and comment on, and that is: does South Africa's foreign policy serve our economic interests? So looking for some comments on that. Garth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just show my mug, and then I'm going to turn it off in the interest of just sort of maintaining stability in the connection. So this is who I am. I'm Garth Lepierre, and I am going to turn my video off and just speak to what I intend to do. But let me start off, if I may, with 3 counts of thanks. The one is to the sterling work that DOD is doing under these very difficult circumstances. I do appreciate all the initiatives that come with the work of the Defend Our Democracy campaigns. And secondly, to my old friend and colleague, Ibrahim Fakir. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And then thirdly, last but not least, to John. John, thank you very much for provocative overview and for sharing your notes with me. Now, with John and Ibrahim's guidance, friends and colleagues, I want to focus my remarks on 3 issues. The first is a contextual introduction, which I think I'm going to cut a little short in the interest of time. And then secondly, I want to focus on what John has asked me to do as far as his guidance for my remarks were concerned. And that is to say something about the implementation challenges that come with the rolling out of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And then thereafter, I want to make some remarks which deals with the very contested discourse of the BRICS and African Union currency. So first, the contextual issues. And here I simply want to leave you with a thought that, the age of globalization has really changed quite fundamentally across the geopolitical terrain, such that we have now entered a dystopian conjuncture, a very dystopian conjuncture of geopolitical division, of adversity and tension, where the liberal international order, and let me underscore this point, the liberal international order is coming under increasing threat, and there are a range of centrifugal forces which are at work. And in this regard, we are witnessing a very troublesome pattern where global norms are being eroded, multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, such as the World Organization, in which developing countries, the voice of developing countries are quite important. These are being further weakened amid growing realist-driven cleavages of power and interest, especially between countries of the North and South, as we now see being played out in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the Russia-Ukraine war and Israel's brutal retaliation in the war on Gaza. So what I'm saying is that we are witnessing a global political economy that is characterized by some of the issues that John raised, such as rising military tensions, very disruptive trade and commercial relations, the specter of climate change and environmental degradation looms very large. There are rising forms of protectionism and neo-mercantilism in the West, as well as a turn to populist opportunism in Europe and the United States. So, against this background, let me now make some remarks about the ambition and challenges that underpin the African Continental Free Trade Area, stroke agreement, as per John's guidance. And I think, it's a very broad area, but let me try and summarize it as follows. And I want to sort of note some important recent developments. the first is that there are now 47 state parties, right? If we think about 57 countries that constitute the African Union, this is very significant that there are 47 state parties which have now ratified the agreement since the beginning of its implementation phase in January 2021, and then entering into force in July 2019. Very importantly, I think for purposes of our discussion, is to note the two phases of negotiation to implement the agreement. This is where the rubber hits the road, in effect. So the first phase of negotiation really relates to phasing down tariffs. Phasing down tariffs, these are, tariffs are really import duties, and the letter and spirit of the agreement dictates that countries will incrementally and gradually phase down tariffs. And now there is agreement among the 47 state parties to phase down tariffs on 97% of all tariff lines. So the 3% that remain really deal with exclusions on infant industries and sensitive industries. And then very importantly also, and there's a synergy between the phasing down of tariffs and liberalizing services trade. Right? The two are very mutually supportive. So the agreement on the Trade in Services Protocol determines that there will be a liberalization in services trade in 5 sectors to begin with. And those 5 sectors are communication, construction, the energy sector, financial services, transport, and then tourism. Those are the 5 sectors. The second phase, which is also as important, will focus on investment, it will focus on competition and intellectual property rights. Now, on intellectual property rights, there's a very important Annex 2 of the agreement, which deals with rules of origin. And this will require a separate seminar, very complex, highly technical. But in any event, the rules of origin are important, which goes to the point that John raised, is how do you, protect, developing countries from competitive penetration and intrusion by third countries. That's essentially what rules of origin are meant to protect. So the negotiations are extremely complex, and by their very nature, mainly because of, I would say, 2 reasons. The first is that the agreement seeks to create a preferential market that is consistent with WTO rules on regional trade agreements, Article, I think, 24 it is, when it comes to the exchange of goods, services, and capital and labor in a very, very large market. This agreement, the AFCFTA, inaugurates on a country-to-country basis the largest free trade market in the world. It's a market of 1.4 billion people. It has a collective GDP of $3.4 billion, and very significantly to John's question, there are 55 economies at very, very different levels of development. 33 of which are categorized as least developed countries, and within that family of LDCs, least developed countries, there are 16 countries which are categorized as landlocked, least developing countries, and then there are 6 which are small island developing states. Now, it is also important to note that a major normative and strategic goal of the agreement is to increase intra-regional trade, from its low of 15% currently to the promise and ambition of 33% over the next decade of implementation. Now, here is the conundrum. Even with a very a permissive regime of tariff liberalization, what these countries confront, and it won't happen unless major non-tariff barriers are addressed, which empower the trading capacity of these 33 LDCs, and included in those are the 16 landlocked countries and the six small and island developing states. Now, what is the nature of the problem here when it comes to non-tariff barriers? And these are very significant to John's question. Firstly, incoherent, inadequate, and inefficient trade policies at national and regional levels. Secondly, complex customs and administrative procedures which are inefficient and costly, and which have a direct impact on the inefficiencies when it comes to cross-border transport systems. The third is a general continental landscape of commodity and extractive dependent economies, lacking in diversity in manufacturing and services. The fourth is inadequate road, ports, rail, and water transport systems, as well as gross deficiencies in soft infrastructure, which includes energy and ICT. And then lastly, there are weak financing mechanisms compounded by the problem of 43 inconvertible currencies, and I'll address this shortly, the measures that have been put in place under the auspices of the AFCFTA, as well as underdeveloped regional mechanisms for finance, credit guarantee schemes for cross-border trade. Now, that's as much as I want to say about the AFCFTA in the interest of time. Now, let me come very briefly to the problems and the challenges of the BRICS and the AU currencies. And this is another area that I think requires, quite a lengthy discussion because it is very technical in nature. But suffice to say that on the BRICS currency and the challenge of de-dollarization, there's a very serious problem here that, there are major obstacles to the initiative of trading in local currencies that would sort of drive the logic of de-dollarization. And that is that there are relatively higher costs and inefficiencies, as well as other imponderables of using several non-dollar currencies. And I want to sort of underscore that point. So, the normative attraction of having currencies that characterize or represent the basket of BRICS currencies is something nice to have, but the reality is otherwise, So, you look at the non-dollar currencies, the Chinese yuan, the South African rand, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, and then the Brazilian real as the basket for cross-border trade and finance. And this becomes then even more complicated. It becomes even more complicated with the admission of the new members, right? So Argentina, I think, is now ambivalent with the new government there in Buenos Aires. So we don't know whether Argentina has dropped out after the admission at the last BRICS summit in South Africa. But, those who have accepted the invitation and who have now joined as of this year include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and then the United Arab Emirates, which will join the BRICS family. So you get a sense of how this complicates and compounds the problem of trading in a local currency. Now, I want to leave you with this conundrum, which is a conundrum that comes from political economy. And I think, if I'm correct, this was something that was highlighted by John Maynard Keynes, and it's called the unholy trinity. It's called the unholy trinity. And what does that mean? It means that the countries, which are essentially emerging markets, in this sense, they cannot simultaneously do three things. This is like having your cake and being able to eat it. You cannot simultaneously do these three things, to realize the ambition of having a common BRICS currency. The one is freedom of capital flows, right? The second is fixed or convertible exchange rates. And then the third is an independent monetary policy. So the question, and I'll leave this for discussion, is which of these three components of the Holy Trinity, however configured, are BRICS countries, or the BRICS plus countries in this case, willing to sacrifice to have their own currency in a manner that breaks the dollar's regressive hegemony in global trade and finance on the one hand, but also deals with the global payment system, which is the basket of the major currencies, right? So it's not only the dollar, but it's the pound sterling, the euro, the Japanese won, etc. So that is what I, more or less what I want to say on the BRICS currency. Now, just a quick word, Ibrahim, if I may, on the African currency regimes. As I've said, that there has been an innovation, and an important innovation, which is to manage the diversity of the continent's 43 currencies that are tradable, theoretically at least, within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And this innovation is called the Pan-African Payment and Settlement Systems. So PAPS, so it's PAP with a double S. So what this is that it is a centralized financial market infrastructure that promotes and enables the efficient and secure flows of currencies across national borders, right? In a manner, in conjunction with central banks nationally, and then, the Pan-African Association of Central Banks, that will ensure that there are low costs and low risk transactions, and that fundamentally, and this is the point, fundamentally reduces the costs of currency convertibility. And here's the point. Reducing the cost of currency convertibility translates into an annual saving of $5 billion. And of course, where the rubber hits the road, and the big challenge, of course, is the implementation of the system in an African environment of currency sovereignty. So, Ibrahim, John, I think, let me stop there. Let's hear from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. Thanks a million. And thanks for not forcing me to use not my seniority, but my authority only in this limited seminar, because we know how much authority you wield over me anyway. Thanks for sticking to time and for teasing out those complexities. I'm sure everyone will agree, always something to learn from John and from you, Garth. Thanks so much. So before I hand over to participants and people who have comments and so on, and there are a couple in the chat. John, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the things, perhaps also tease out some of the complexities of the two questions I raised, perhaps also address the several barriers, not just the three in the Holy Trinity, but the issues that Prof. Lapierre was pointing out about the sort of very unevenly developed countries in the system, the differentials in terms of currency strength, but also regulatory infrastructure in those particular countries, soft stuff that he was noting about ICT penetration, but also simply availability, hard infrastructure, and so on. So perhaps take a couple minutes for that, and then I'll go to some of the people in the chat. And then Garth, I'll give you another minute or two to perhaps also say a couple things and then go to the chat. So John, over to you for now.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim, and thanks, Garth. You didn't disappoint after my saying you're steeped in the issues on trade and currencies in Africa. My start out point is obsessing about getting job growth in South Africa and, of course, Africa, but and that requires development. So for me, I measure everything against that just about. And my concern, I think, which Garth, I think, confirmed, is that currency universal currency or a free trade agreement are not quick solutions, and they're not deep solutions to those problems. So they're good for many reasons, but I think Garth and I think Garth will correct me if I'm wrong, on the same page about that. I want to address a couple of the other questions that were raised. Now, I think you asked about how you deal with the fact that we're on the ICJ case, but Mozambique's on the other side of it. I think that's inevitable, Ibrahim. I think that's always going to be the case. And that's why I was saying foreign policy is multi-dimensional chess, not checkers. We cannot say we're not going to deal with India because we disagree with them on Israel, for example. India is a country that's vast, it's important, it's developmental, which for me is an important factor. I find it India and China are really understand development in a way I would say Russia does not. We can debate. We don't have time to debate that, but we can if someone wants to ask about it. And so we obviously India also has it's run by a Hindu nationalist government. They don't treat Muslims equally. I think we're entitled to raise our values when they're conflicted, even on an issue like that. But we have to be deft about it because we're always going to have these disagreements. And I think we do have some protection if we're consistent in not fobbing off bad behavior by friends. Especially not minor issues, but when it's egregious, that gives us a stronger position to take a different position if we need to. But we need to be friends with most countries in the world, and I think that's part of our development. I wanted to make a point about. Someone asked about. Oh yes. Someone asked about the issue of, on the chat, someone asked about Eskom and Transnet. Well, of course, we're discussing that in some other of our webinars, so there's no reason to raise it now. We all know I was at a load shed this morning while I was preparing. We know Transnet is a terrible problem. Those have got to be sorted out, but I think it's and they are intrinsic to trade, but sorting them out for me is a separate issue, which I have addressed other times. I want to respond to Bash Teba, who says, how can I measure growth in terms of GDP and not PPP? And there are a few people who ask, what's PPP? Purchasing power parity means comparing countries by living standards, not simply by dollar value. And I think Bash is right to a very considerable degree. I wondered if I should do PPP as well, but I didn't have time and didn't want to overcomplicate it. But it's quite true that China has overtaken the US in terms of purchasing power parity, which is significant. However, I don't retract my views that China is facing some rather more serious crisis than it's faced since 1979. And you also say that the US economy is a war economy dominated by an oligarch class of 1%. There's some truth in that, but if you go to the US, you'll see that the middle class is very large in America. It's larger than most countries in the world by percentages. And although all the problems you can raise are correct, you could certainly apply some of them to Russia, for instance. But the main point is, I think you make a good point about purchasing power parity. But it's not irrelevant that America's GDP is growing faster now than China's. It may not last. I have no idea if it will last. I don't think it can last too long because a mature economy can't grow as fast as a younger economy. But anyway, that's. Is there anything else I need to respond to? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop there and listen to the response.
Sure. It's a couple of things before we go on, and Garth, I'll give you a moment just to reflect for another minute or two and respond to some things if you like. Just remember the question, the Polis question: does South Africa's foreign policy serve its economic interests? DOD would obviously like you to interact and respond to that. The Polis question and the link to it is in the chat. There's also an important question from two interlocutors, one, the former Secretary General of the ANC, Sankey Tembi-Mahanyele, who the seminar series are all available online. Defend Our Democracy will make those available. They are already. Can we please post a place where the repository of that is? Also, another comment about some of the presentations. As I say, they are all available. They're all the previous webinar links are available, so the full recordings and presentations are available for all of them. That's just by way of that. And of course, please don't forget the Polis question: does South Africa's its foreign policy serve its economic interests? John, I just wanted to say something quickly about, yes, of course we should be dealing with all these countries, even though we're going to have fundamental disagreements with them, right? The question, though, from a political perspective is will they want to deal with us, without us having to compromise our sovereignty? The US is pretty adept at doing that, of playing its game. And many of those people who are in the alternative formations may at some point use the incentive and the leverage exercised by their other friends to lean on or undermine interests that South Africa has. So I'm not asking you to respond immediately. I'm just saying that's a point worth thinking about. Garth, a couple of things from you before I open up for some more comments and so
on? Could I just sort of make...
Garth, you muted yourself. Or someone muted you. But of course you can Garth. Sorry, while I wait for Garth to come back, anyone else?
Am I back now, Ibrahim?
Yeah, there we go. There you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to make this a very quick point that South Africa has a very progressive trade strategy and a broad, economic diplomacy agenda that unfolds across different concentric circles. But the reality is that, those concentric circles can only deliver reciprocal benefits if this economy grows. And as we know, for the last 10 years or so, there have been heavy recessionary winds that have been blowing through this economy, such that we cannot take advantage of, those reciprocal benefits, whether in SACU, which is the customs union, and South Africa really plays a very important role there in terms of managing the revenue pool. But, not to be facetious, SACU essentially now represents a glorified ATM for the likes of Eswatini and Lesotho. Then we look at SADC, where South Africa has made major asymmetric commitments as far as the 2008 free trade area is concerned, which was driven by this country, to diversify the economies, to really drive these economies, even though, on the basis of a kind of variable geometry kind of formulation, to greater levels of industrialization and growth and development. And then, the third concentric circle is, of course, the continent, where our role has been very controversial in the sense that, The comparative and competitive advantages that this country has have been replicated across the continent in a very predatory and undevelopmental manner, whether there's been mining, financial services, construction, manufacturing, telecoms, or the leisure and hotel industry. And then we look at the broader global context where, we have not really reaped major benefits from the European Union, its protectionist kind of ethos. And remember that South Africa has this TDCA, which is very unique, the Trade Development Cooperation Agreement, which is both for trade and developmental purposes, but the European Union has continued to throw up all sorts of barriers, especially, concerning tariff peaks and tariff escalation in products that we have some comparative and competitive advantages in. And now, we are now faced the specter of, because of the ICJ ruling, of losing our preferential preferences to AGOA, right? The African Growth and Opportunity Act, which are quite substantial. The benefits that this economy arrives, something in the order of like $5 billion per annum. However, I do think the great promise for me is in new forms of Southern trade multilateralism, trading in greater volumes, provided that this economy can get its act together with countries of the South. And those are the new growth nodes, I would argue. And there are a variety of empirical indices to show this beyond China, that the South represents a new nexus for a global economic order that moves away from simply dependence of trade with the West. And let me leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Garth. So anyone in the audience, question, reflection, issues you want to raise, things you want to tease out? Rolf and Bash, who had quite a bit of a conversation, give each of you perhaps a moment. Rolf, if you want to come in for a bit and state your question or reflections, and perhaps get some comment from the two.
Okay, there we are. I just think that even though the measure of GDP does not show everything, because it doesn't show the inequality. For instance, you can have a few people being very rich while most people are still poor, but it does show the capacity of the whole economy as a unit. For instance, China. The reason why they are able to build all these huge numbers of motor cars, for instance, is because of the capacity of the economy. While even if you go to Singapore, which has got a very high living standard, it won't be able to do that because it hasn't got the numbers. And in this sense, I think GDP does have a value. It's just that maybe one should get another way of dealing with economic growth in the total sense, morally better. In other words, that also takes into consideration how many of the people of the country is still poor.
Bash, any further comments from you other than the discussion that John has already addressed, particularly around measuring GDP versus purchasing power parity and so on? at least rebasing on the calculation of how you calculate an economy's worth. Of course, there are ideological questions about it, but if you perhaps want to say something else, anyone else, please feel free. We are happy to take comments and reflections or even questions. If there aren't, I will continue abusing my my role as the chair and pose questions of my own. So if there's nothing else, John, if you want to respond to some of the things which have been raised, particularly some of the complexities and perhaps contradictions, and then Garth, you'll have a moment to do so as well. We still have a good 10 minutes or so before we conclude for today. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Ebrahim. Yes, I did want to comment on a couple of things. You raised the issue of how do we get away with it? How do we have the ICJ case without it destroying our position on AGOA, the American Growth and Opportunity Act, which benefits us to the tune of several billion a year in exports. My response to that is that dexterity has a real value. I see Bash wants to comment. Why did you let him comment, and then I'll come back with my last final comment.
Go ahead, Bash. John, you'll keep the notes here. But Bash, you're asking me if you can comment, but I did say you must. Now, and now you've gone silent on us again. Bash?
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. Solomon, just on the issue of the PPP, and I think this is important what you call it. As much as we are saying that GDP and the US and all the rest of it, and the leading economies, and Europe and Eurocentric and all this broad capitalist kind of notions of growth, and Rolf makes the point that if the 1% own everything, and just as we know, South Africa is the most unequal, one of the more unequal countries in the world. The fact that China could raise 800 million people out of poverty, and this didn't come easy. I mean, this came with 3 million Chinese Communist Party members dying, trying to achieve this, okay, or working to achieve this, sorry. So the fact that they've brought 800 million people out of poverty with no wars, with no military-industrial complex, with no, and people will make enough noises about the Uyghurs and all of that, but I mean, none of that has been proven. And the fact that that the Belt and Road, for example, is a major, what you call it, and the West can do all it wants to counter this with some corridor through Zionist Israel, and the elimination of the Palestinians with India and all these other dynastic rulers, that I think it's important that we really focus on BRICS. And as much as India might be, doesn't know where it is, but it's important because, especially in South Africa, if we don't have, we can have a GDP of $100 trillion, and if it's owned by Naspers and owned by whoever, what does that do to the guy in the squatter camp? That's my only comment. Yeah, I just if you can tease through that, please, because for me, growth is measured by uplifting people and not by the oligarchs. Thanks.
Shall I go ahead, Ebrahim? Thanks. Well, thank you, Bash, for your comments. I have several responses. First of all, I completely agree. I've actually written about the growth they've achieved in many different places, including in my book, Cyril's Choices. That bringing 800 million out of poverty is a historic move. and it was done under Deng Xiaoping. Obviously, he wasn't alone, but I always describe Deng Xiaoping as the greatest economic reformer in the history of the world. I think that's indisputable. What I was saying is, what I am tied to is facts, at least as far as I can assess them. Obviously, we can all differ in our opinions about those interpretations of those facts. China's growth has been historic. There's no question. I praise it to the sky every time I get a chance. And I made the point that it's a developmental economy. I think that's much more important to us than countries that are not developmental and can't give us that kind of lift to. And the issue of developing everybody is what all my work is about. In terms, if you go and look at the third webinar, which is now on the Facebook page of Defend Our Democracy, where I talk, and I mean, my main purpose is explicitly how we can get growth in South Africa. And if you look, you do need to delve into the details, because, for instance, government has a policy of creating smart cities. They want to build one at the old airport outside between Joburg and Pretoria. And I've looked into that and I've read the research on that. And there's a lot of research that says that a smart city will increase inequality, it won't improve it. So I'm saying I would much rather spend government resources on improving Wi-Fi in the townships and in other places accessible to the poor. So there are many ways to do that. I think it does require delving a little deeper. But going forward, I think China's future is not the same as its past. Oh, the other thing that you're absolutely right about is China hasn't been at war since 1979, except there was this minor skirmish with India. There have been a few of those, but that they haven't been to war since 1979. When I was in Afghanistan, China was starting some mines in the middle of the war, and they were being protected by the United States Army. I mean, what could be more absurd than that? It shows the stupidity of American policy and the cleverness of Chinese policy. So there's no doubt about that. But going forward, if you will see, maybe I'll be proved wrong, but if you watch over the next 10 years, I don't believe China's growth can be the same as it was for the reasons I described. The final point I wanted to make was partly in response to Ibrahim pressing the point that how do we deal with the Americans at the same time as we're dealing with Israel and the ICJ. And my point here is this. It requires dexterity in foreign policy. I lived in Washington. I covered the Congress for 6 years. And I can tell you one of the biggest problems we have is that individual congresspersons and senators are getting very angry with South Africa. They can make the final decision about whether we stay in AGOA next year. And a lot of that has to do with a dexterous handling of foreign policy. And I think it's necessary to criticize DIRCO on that score. And let me give you a couple of examples. Think about the Lady R issue that came along. So the United States raised it with Sidney Mufamadi in Washington, I think in December of that year, 2022. Nothing was done by the government. They then sent Janet Yellen out here, the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, I don't know when an American Secretary of the Treasury was last been in South Africa, and she came to raise that issue and say, this is a serious problem for us. And the United States Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, has all kinds of powers that are affected by this. The Treasury controls the Secret Service and on things like that. So, I think it's a Secret Service. So, and nothing was done. And then they raised the American ambassador raised it publicly, and he raised it stupidly. And he got a lot of pushback. Now, and then South Africa, President Ramaphosa started a commission of inquiry. Now, I mean, anybody who knows this world would have said, why didn't the president call the defense minister, who he sits next to in cabinet once a week anyway, and say, give me the answer by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning? You don't need a commission of inquiry. And so what this did was it meant you had day after day after day of bad publicity in Washington. Congress people saying, what is wrong with South Africa? Why can't they deal with this issue? They're stalling us, they're deceiving us, they're not being straight with us. So handling it dexterously would have done us a lot of good. And I want to finally tell you this quick story before we run out of time. I read the New York Times every day. And on the day that, the Friday, the ICJ judgment was issued, I opened my New York Times on computer, of course, and I saw that the top item on the top item in the New York Times was nothing to do with the ICJ. Second or third item, second item not either. The next item was about Israel and America complaining about members of the United Nations UNRWA force in Palestine who were working for Hamas and were allegedly involved in the October 7th attack in Israel, southern Israel. Now, when I looked at that, I thought, there's a PR company hard at work in Washington. They obviously knew that information a long time. They deliberately withheld it and released it on the same day as the judgment, so they would take South Africa's headline away. And they not only did that, the second item on the New York Times about, on the Middle East after that was what is UNRWA and what does it do? And, in other words, questioning its genuineness. My own take on it as an ex-UN person, by the way, is they have 16,000 Gazans working for UNRWA. So it doesn't surprise me at all that 12 of them may have been politically involved and kept it secret. I think it's hard to be totally pure about it. Obviously, the UN tries to avoid it, but you can't possibly. So the point I'm making is that's the game you're in if you're in diplomacy. You've got to manage the media extremely carefully, certainly in terms of Washington, if you're worried about the decision on AGOA. And we have to up our game. So, when something like that Lady Art comes up, we handle it quickly. And then I would, so you get the point. There's no risk-free diplomacy or foreign policy. But if we want to stick to our principles and defend our interests at the same time, we have to be pretty slick about it.
Right, sure. But I mean, it does raise the question, then how, do you play the game consistently of strategy, or do you have to, at some stage, sort of sacrifice honesty and let strategy trump over honesty? But I mean, that's a whole separate debate. But the point is well made. We got a couple minutes before we go. Garth, I want to give you a final opportunity to say a few things before we wrap up and round up. There is a question from Solihatia about wanting 3 to 5 practical steps for creating jobs. Just to say that we can repeat them here, but there is an entire seminar, Soli, which is dedicated to that. In fact, 2 of them. John has outlined certain policy areas. If I remember one, it's not 4IR, it's not AI, but it is actually the information tech, what he calls intensified 3IR. Then there's the things around the green economy, then there's manufacturing and industrialization and infrastructure, but there's an entire seminar, 2 seminars in fact, which are dedicated to that. So I don't know if we want to traverse ground that we already has. Those practical things are already out there. Please have a look at the list of webinar topics and the webinar recordings. They're all there. Also, please remember the Polis question that DOD have posted. The link is there. Does South Africa's foreign policy serve its economic interests? Garth, a couple things from you if you want to round up, and then John to finally round it off, and then we can close. We close to the time.
Ibrahim, mine would be a simple suggestion or recommendation, and that is that, what this discussion has done for me is really raise the important debate
Thanks so much, Garth. So DOD, here's a free suggestion from Garth about probably a new series, slightly configured, slightly differently than the current one, which raises the debates, the questions, penetrates into them. But there's possibly space for a new series. John, if you want to round us up and close us off for today.
Thanks, Ibrahim. I won't repeat anything I've said. I'll just respond very quickly to Garth's last point. Garth, if you go look at some of the earlier webinars, particularly webinar 3, we talk about this quite specifically. And I make the point that the country that grew the fastest in the entire world from 2000 to 2019 was an African country that adopted developmental state principles, teaches it in their universities, and the state leadership, government leadership, are steeped in developmental state policies and understand them and know how to implement them based on their own economy. And that country is Ethiopia. So, and there are other African countries that are doing so better than us. And I think we've got so many people we can learn from. We need to base our solutions on our own economy rather than other people's. But the development skill state essentially is tried and tested, and it works if it's applied properly.
Thanks, John. Thanks. And of course, participants will know, some who have attended previous ones, others who did not. There is an entire suite of these discussions focusing also on SOEs, focusing on the policy areas to rapidly create jobs and so on. Some of these are also pointed out in John's book, Cyril's Choices, which you can see the cover of there, also highly recommended. I want to thank you guys, everyone, for attending again. We have done very well in terms of time in every seminar that we've had. We've stuck to the hour and a half. Thanks, John, for efficiently always putting the probing issues out there. And today, especially, thanks to Prof. Garth Lapierre for making interventions in the way that he did, always helpful and useful. Thank you guys all for attending. And of course, thanks to DOD and the DOD team for facilitating and hosting us. Keep a lookout, please, for the next one, which is going to be the second in the series focusing on foreign policy. We probably won't have an economic, developmental, and trade approach in the next one. We'll probably be looking at things like peace, security, and defense. But we can attempt some of the questions again. But as I say, all of the big seminars are available for recording, and they are available. DOD will make those available. Keep a lookout for the next one. Please remember the Polis question and try and interact with it. The link is up in the chat still. And the question is, does South African foreign policy serve its economic interest? They desperately love for everyone to interact with that and give some comments and so on. So hopefully see you guys in the next one. Thanks, everyone. And keep a lookout for the notice for the next one and the new link. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thanks.